The day they buried her brother was the day Mamie Atwood stopped speaking, and the whole town of Caldwell, Kansas, noticed it the way you notice a church bell that suddenly goes silent in the middle of a hymn. It was the autumn of 1878, and the prairie wind had turned cold and cutting, bending the long grass flat against the red earth and sending tumbleweeds rolling down the main street of Caldwell like they were trying to escape something that could not be named. Mamie stood at the graveside in a black wool dress that had belonged to her mother, which meant it was slightly too wide at the shoulders and slightly too long at the hem, and she did not cry. She had done her crying the night before, alone in the small bedroom of the house she had shared with her brother James for the past 3 years, pressing her face into the quilt so no one could hear her. By morning there was nothing left in her but a hollow, ringing quiet, and she carried that quiet with her to the churchyard, and she carried it home again after, and she set it down in the house like it was another piece of furniture, heavy and permanent, and she did not know how to move around it. James Atwood had been 26 years old. He had been thrown from his horse on a Tuesday, which was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday in every other way. A rattlesnake had startled the animal near the draw south of town, and James had hit the ground wrong, the back of his head striking a limestone rock, and he had not woken up after that. He had lain in the bed in the back room for 4 days while the doctor from Wichita made the long ride down and said there was nothing to be done, and Mamie had sat beside him for all 4 of those days and nights, holding his hand, watching his chest rise and fall in a rhythm that grew slower and slower until it did not rise at all. She was 23 years old. She had no other family within 300 miles. She had a small cattle operation on 40 acres outside of town that she and James had built together over 3 hard years, and she had 7 head of cattle, a vegetable garden that was mostly spent for the season, a milk cow named Ruth, 2 horses, a dog named Pepper who was getting old, and a heart that felt like it had been emptied out with a tin ladle and left in the sun to dry. The neighbors brought food, the way people do. Mrs. Hennessy from the dry goods store brought a covered dish of roasted chicken and sat on Mamie's porch for 20 minutes talking without seeming to notice that Mamie said nothing in return. Reverend Cole came by and read scripture in a warm, practiced voice and told Mamie that James was with the Lord now, which Mamie supposed was meant to be comforting, though she kept thinking about the fact that James was not with her, and that seemed like the more pressing problem. The women from the church quilting circle left a basket of bread and preserves on the doorstep and tied a ribbon around the handle, and Mamie looked at the ribbon for a long time before she carried the basket inside. Thomas Bailey arrived in Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon, 8 days after James Atwood was buried, riding a broad-chested bay gelding named Porter and trailing a pack mule loaded down with a bedroll, a leather saddlebag full of tools, and a general quiet about him that most people in a new town would have called reserved. He was 28 years old, tall and lean in the way of men who work outdoors through all 4 seasons, with dark hair under a battered tan hat and hands that were calloused and capable-looking, and eyes the color of creek water in October, a kind of gray-green that changed depending on the light. He had come up from Texas, from a spread outside of San Antonio where he had worked as a ranch hand for 6 years, and he had left because the ranch had sold, and the new owner had brought his own men, and there was nothing mean or dramatic about it, just the ordinary restlessness of a man who knew how to work and needed somewhere to put that work. He stopped at the livery stable first, the way any sensible man did, and got his horse settled and fed, and then he went to the saloon, not to drink heavily but to sit and listen, because a saloon in any frontier town was the fastest way to understand what kind of place you had ridden into. The saloon in Caldwell was called the Prairie Rose, which Thomas thought was an optimistic name for a building held together with ambition and crooked nails, and he ordered a beer and sat at a table near the window and listened to the conversations around him the way a man listens to weather. He heard about James Atwood within 10 minutes, because a small town's grief is a public thing, woven into the fabric of every conversation the way warp threads are woven into cloth. He heard that the Atwood boy had died of a fall, that his sister was out on the 40 acres south of the Bluebell Creek crossing, and that she was managing alone, which several of the men at the bar agreed was a hard situation for a woman. One of them said he had ridden out to offer his help the week before, and she had come to the door and looked at him without saying a word, and he had eventually thanked her for her time and ridden away, which he admitted felt foolish, but he had not known what else to do. Thomas finished his beer and did not say anything about any of it, because it was not his business, and he had only been in town for 2 hours. He rented a room at the boarding house run by a stout, efficient woman named Mrs. Parrish, who gave him a room on the second floor with a window facing east, and informed him that breakfast was at 6 and supper was at 6:30, and she did not tolerate drinking in the rooms. Thomas said that was fine and unpacked his saddlebag and went asleep. In the morning he went to the livery and asked if there was any work to be had around town. The liveryman, a barrel-shaped man named Walt Greer, told him that Pete Harmon over at the feed store needed a man to help with deliveries and the occasional fence repair, and that the widow Carson on the North Road had been looking for someone to fix her barn roof before the first hard freeze came. Thomas went to Pete Harmon first and got work starting Monday, and then he rode out to the widow Carson's and looked at the barn roof and gave her a price for the materials and the labor, and she accepted it, and he started that same afternoon because there was no reason to wait. He worked on the widow Carson's barn roof for 2 days. He was up there on the third morning, sorting shingles, when he looked south down the road that ran along the ridge and saw a woman walking. She was walking without particular purpose or hurry, which was unusual, because women in Caldwell generally walked with somewhere to be, carrying something and moving with efficiency. This woman was walking the way water moves when it has no riverbed to guide it, drifting south along the road with her arms at her sides and her dark hair loose under a plain bonnet. She had a black shawl around her shoulders, and she was looking at the ground mostly, though once she stopped and looked at the sky for a long while before she started walking again. Thomas watched her without meaning to. There was something in the way she moved that caught at him, the way a snag catches at a fishing line, something slow and almost underwater about it that made him think of grief before he knew who she was. He did not know who she was until that evening at supper, when he described what he had seen to Mrs. Parrish in passing, and Mrs. Parrish shook her head and said, "That will be Mamie Atwood. She walks sometimes, since her brother passed. I think it helps her, though she never says so because she does not say much of anything these days, poor dear." Thomas thought about that for several days without acting on it, because he was not the sort of man who acted without thinking, and because it was genuinely not his business. He fixed the widow Carson's roof. He started working at Pete Harmon's feed store and found he liked the work, the lifting and hauling and the smell of grain and clean hay, the orderly rhythm of it. He made acquaintances with some of the men in town, the kind of quiet acquaintances that suited him, where you nod and exchange a few words and both parties go about their business without much obligation. He was comfortable in Caldwell in a way he had not expected to be, and he had begun to think he might stay through the winter at least. On a Saturday morning in late October, Pete Harmon told him there was a delivery to make to the Atwood place south of Bluebell Creek, a 100-pound sack of oats and 2 smaller bags of grain that the woman had ordered earlier in the week. He said it with a particular look, a look that Thomas recognized as a look people give when they want to communicate that a thing requires some delicacy, but they do not want to say so directly. Thomas loaded the wagon and drove south on the creek road, and the prairie that morning was exactly the kind of beautiful that demands nothing of you, wide open under a pale blue sky with the last of the autumn grasses gone to gold and the creek glittering through the cottonwoods down in the draw. The Atwood place was a modest homestead, a clapboard house with a covered porch, a small barn, a pen for cattle and one for the milk cow, a garden that had gone to dry stalks for the season. It was neat and well kept in the way that told you the person who kept it paid attention, even now. There was a dog asleep on the porch steps, an old brown and black dog with gray around its muzzle, and the dog lifted its head when Thomas drove the wagon into the yard but did not bother to stand. Mamie Atwood came out the front door before he had finished setting the brake. She was not what he had expected, though he could not have said what he had expected. She was slender and straight-backed, not tall, with dark eyes and a quality of stillness to her face that was not blankness. It was more like a place that had been very full of something and was now very empty, and the shape of that fullness was still visible in the lines around her mouth and eyes. She was wearing a plain brown dress and her hair was pinned up neatly, and she looked at him and then at the wagon and then back at him. "Thomas Bailey," he said, taking off his hat. "From Pete Harmon's store. I have your grain order." She nodded. She did not say anything. He climbed down from the wagon and started to unload, and she went to the barn to show him where to put the sacks, pointing rather than speaking, and he carried the 100-pound sack of oats on his back the way a man does who has done it 1,000 times without drama, and set it where she indicated, and then went back for the smaller bags. When he was done, he stood in the barn doorway and she was standing near the milk cow's stall, one hand resting on the top rail of the gate, not looking at anything in particular. He thought about saying he was sorry for her loss. He thought about asking if she needed anything else. He had heard from Mrs. Parrish that people kept asking if she needed anything, and she kept looking at them in a way that made them go away, and he understood that, because what she needed was not the kind of thing you could deliver on a grain wagon. So he said, "I can check your fence line before I go if you want. Won't take long. The cold is coming on and a fence that's weak now will be trouble by January." She looked at him for a moment. He held her gaze steadily, the way you hold a horse's gaze, without challenge and without backing away, just present and level. She gave a small nod. He walked the perimeter of the cattle pen and found 2 loose posts on the north side and 1 broken rail on the east. He went back to the wagon for the tools he kept in the bed, because he always kept tools in the bed, and he fixed the posts and replaced the rail using timber from a stack he found on the south side of the barn. It took him 40 minutes. She stood at the kitchen window and he could see the shape of her there from the corner of his eye when he worked near the house, and it occurred to him that it was probably strange to have someone working on your property when you had not asked for it, but she had nodded, which was enough. He came back to knock on the door to tell her he was finished. She opened the door and looked at him. "Fence is sound," he said. "That should hold through winter. There's a spot on the east post where the wood is starting to rot low down. You'll want to replace that post come spring." She looked at him. He thought he saw something shift in her eyes, not quite gratitude, more like the look of a person who has been spoken to like a person rather than a problem to be solved. "I'll be going," he said, and put his hat back on and went to the wagon. He was up on the seat and about to click to the horse when he heard the door open again. He looked back. She was standing on the porch with her arms crossed, and she said very quietly, as if she had not used her voice in some time and was not entirely sure it still worked, "What do I owe you for the fence work?" "Nothing," he said. "It wasn't a favor. I just don't like seeing a fence go to waste." He drove away and she stood watching the wagon until it turned the bend at the cottonwoods and disappeared. He came back the following Wednesday. Not because Pete Harmon sent him, but because when he had climbed back up on the Widow Carson's barn to check that the new shingles were seated properly, he had looked south down the road again and thought about the rotted fence post, and then thought about the fact that there were other things that were probably wearing thin on a 40-acre place, managed by a single woman in the weeks after a terrible loss, and he was a man who noticed those things and could not leave them alone. He had a half-day free on Wednesday afternoons because Pete Harmon closed the store at noon to visit his wife's grave, which was a habit the town respected and nobody questioned. Thomas rode Porter out to the Atwood place and tied him to the post by the barn, and looked around the property with the eye of a man who has worked ranches all his life and knows what accumulated neglect looks like. There was a section of the barn siding that had warped and pulled away from the frame. There was a broken hinge on the chicken coop door. There was a pile of firewood that was not nearly large enough for a Kansas winter. Mamie came out of the house when she heard the horse. She looked at him and then at Porter and then back at him. "I had a free afternoon," he said. "Thought I would look at that barn siding." She stood very still for a moment. The old dog Pepper came around the corner of the house and sat down beside her feet. "All right," she said. "He worked for 3 hours." She went inside and came out again several times, checking on the chickens, carrying water to the garden even though the garden was spent, doing the small necessary tasks of a working homestead. Around 3 o'clock she appeared beside him, where he was working on the barn siding, and held out a tin mug. He took it. It was coffee, strong and black, and it was one of the best cups of coffee he had ever had in his life, though he could not have explained why. He said, "Thank you." She went back inside. He finished the siding and fixed the chicken coop hinge and then split a full cord of firewood from the log pile at the back of the barn, stacking it neatly under the overhang of the barn roof where it would stay dry. The splitting took most of the remaining daylight. When he was done, he was pleasantly tired in the way of honest physical work, and the sky was going orange in the west, and the cold was settling in with authority. She was standing on the porch when he turned around from the wood pile. Just standing there watching him. The last of the orange light was on her face and she had her shawl pulled tight and she looked at him without expression, though it was not the blankness he had seen that first day. It was something more careful than that. The look of a person beginning to understand something without being entirely sure they want to. "I will be back next Wednesday," he said, "if that is all right." A pause. Then, "Yes." He rode back to town in the dark. And so it began, this quiet arrangement that neither of them named or defined. He came on Wednesdays and he worked, and sometimes she brought him coffee, and sometimes she worked near him in silence, and neither of them pushed the other toward conversation. There was a dignity in the silence that Thomas respected instinctively. He had known grief, had lost his father to a fever when he was 19 and working his first real ranch job, and he remembered that the people who had made it worse were the ones who talked, who filled the silence with words as if silence itself were the problem. The silence was not the problem. The silence was the shape the loss took, and you had to let it have its shape. Mamie was not oblivious to this. She was a perceptive woman who had, before the death of her brother, been known in Caldwell as quick-witted and direct, someone you wanted on your side in an argument about a land boundary or a commercial dispute, because she would cut to the heart of the matter without excess. The grief had not taken her intelligence. It had taken her words for a while, the way a river sometimes goes underground and moves through the rock in the dark before it surfaces again. She was aware that the man who came on Wednesdays was different from the others who came. He did not try to fill the empty air with reassurances. He did not tell her James was in a better place. He just showed up and worked, and when he looked at her, it was with a directness that was not intrusive, just honest, the way you look at a horizon. On the third Wednesday he was there. A cold November wind came in from the north and turned the air sharp as tin, and Thomas was repairing a section of the pasture fence that had given way under a fallen cottonwood branch, and Mamie came out not with coffee this time but with a coat, a man's coat, which had been James's coat, and she held it out to him without looking at his face. He took it. He did not say anything about the coat. He put it on over his own vest and went back to work. Later, when he returned the coat and she took it back and held it against her chest for a moment with both arms around it before she carried it inside, he saw that and understood it completely and said nothing, which was the only right thing to do. November moved through the Kansas plains the way it always did, with a relentlessness that was almost personal, gray skies pressing down, and the temperature dropping a little further each week, the creek developing a skim of ice at the edges in the mornings. Thomas kept to his Wednesdays. He fixed the things that were broken and checked on the things that were sound, and he split more firewood because a woman alone going into a hard winter needed more firewood than she thought. He fed the cattle when she seemed too tired to do it herself, and once, when he arrived and found her sitting on the back step of the house with her knees pulled up and her face turned toward the bare branches of the elm tree at the property line, he walked past her to the barn and fed the cattle and watered the horses and came back out and sat down on the step beside her, not touching her, just there. 2 feet of air between them and the winter sky above and the old dog Pepper lying at her feet. He sat there for a long time. She did not speak and he did not speak. After a while she took a slow breath and let it out, and he could hear in the sound of it all the weight she was carrying, and he felt the urge to say something, to offer something, to fix the thing that was broken in her the way he fixed the fence posts and the barn siding, and he resisted that urge because he knew it was not fixable that way. It was only time and presence, and he could offer the presence. It was the most intimate thing he had ever done with another person, and they had not touched and they had not spoken. When the light had gone from the sky and the temperature had dropped another 5 degrees and the first stars were appearing, she said, very quietly, he used to like to look at the elm tree. He said it was the best shade tree he had ever seen and he wanted to put a bench there come spring. Thomas let those words settle into the air for a moment. Then he said, "It is a good tree for a bench." She did not say anything more, but something shifted. Something very small and very important. The way the first hairline crack appears in river ice before the whole thing breaks open to the water again. December came, and with it the first hard freeze, and the cattle on the Atwood place needed watching, and Mamie was doing it. But Thomas could see that she was running herself ragged doing it alone, because the cold added an hour to every task, and the water troughs were freezing and needed breaking twice a day, and the cattle needed to be checked for signs of cold stress, and she was doing all of it on her own without complaint, which he admired and also thought was going to break her down to nothing if it continued. He started coming on Saturdays too. He did not make a production of it. He simply appeared on Saturday mornings with Porter and tied up at the hitching post and got to work, and the first Saturday she came out of the house with a question in her eyes and he said, "Cold spell. You could use a hand," and she looked at him for a moment and then nodded and went back inside to put more wood on the fire. That first Saturday he stayed until midday, and when he was ready to leave she asked him if he wanted to eat before he went. He said he did not want to put her out. She said he was not putting her out. She had made a pot of soup and it was more than one person needed. He came inside. The kitchen was warm and smelled of onions and sage and wood smoke, and Mamie set 2 bowls on the table and bread she had baked herself, good dense bread with a firm crust, and they sat across from each other at the small wooden table. It was the first time he had been inside the house. It was a spare room, neat, with a few things that spoke of a life carefully assembled, a braided rug on the floor, a shelf of books above the fireplace, a framed drawing on the wall that he guessed was the work of someone who loved drawing more than they were skilled at it, perhaps James, he thought. They ate in silence for most of the meal, but it was a comfortable silence, the silence of 2 people who have gotten used to each other's presence and do not feel the need to perform companionship. Near the end she said, "Where are you from, Mr. Bailey?" He said, "Texas." "Outside of San Antonio," she said. "Do you have family there?" He said, "My mother. A sister who married a man with a fruit farm out in California." She nodded. She looked at her bowl for a moment and then said, "James was all I had left of our family. Our parents died in the crossing before we got to Kansas. Cholera. We came out from Ohio in '74. Thomas said, "That is a hard road." She looked up at him then directly, and he saw something in her eyes that was not grief alone but a kind of recognition, the look of a person who has heard the truth offered plainly and finds it more sustaining than comfort. "It is," she said. He helped her wash the bowls and the pot before he left because it was the natural thing to do, and she did not tell him not to. He rode back to Caldwell in the thin December light and felt something in his chest that he did not examine too closely, a warmth that had nothing to do with the soup. Christmas came to Caldwell in a pale and quiet way. A light snow on Christmas Eve that softened all the edges of the world and made the town look briefly like something from a painting. Thomas attended the Christmas service at Reverend Cole's church because Mrs. Parrish expected it, and because he liked the music, the singing of hymns in a room full of people being briefly better than they were on ordinary days. He scanned the congregation and found Mamie 3 rows ahead and to the left, sitting alone in the pew that had probably once held 2 people, and he watched her for a moment during the singing and saw that she was singing the hymn very softly, barely more than mouthing the words, and that her eyes were bright though she was not crying. He caught up with her on the church steps after the service. She was pulling on her gloves and she looked up when he said her name, or rather when he said, Miss Atwood, because he had not yet used her given name. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Bailey," she said. She sounded steadier than she had in the early weeks, though the hollowness was still there in her voice underneath, the way the shape of a window frame is still visible even after the glass is gone. "Merry Christmas," he said. He had, on a somewhat uncomfortable impulse he had not fully thought through, stopped at the dry goods store earlier in the week and purchased a small tin of hard candies, the kind with a peppermint flavor and a red swirl, which he now produced somewhat awkwardly from his coat pocket and held out toward her. She looked at the tin for a moment. Then she took it and held it in both gloved hands and looked at it. "James had a weakness for peppermints," she said. And then she stopped because she had not expected to say that, and neither had he. The silence stretched for a moment, one of those delicate silences that could go in any direction. "I know it's a small thing," Thomas said. "No," she said quietly. "It is a kind thing." She tucked the tin into her coat pocket and looked up at him with those dark eyes that had winter sky behind them. "Will you be out on Wednesday?" "Yes," he said. She nodded and pulled her hat lower against the wind and walked toward her wagon. In January, Caldwell had a cold snap that the old-timers in the saloon called one of the worst since '73, with temperatures dropping below zero at night and the wind coming off the plains with nothing to stop it for 300 miles. Thomas rode out to the Atwood place on Wednesday morning and found that one of the cattle, a young heifer, was in distress in the far corner of the pasture, shivering and separated from the rest of the small herd. Mamie was already out there with her, crouched beside the animal in the snow with a blanket over the heifer's back, and she had been out there for what Thomas could see from the tracks had been at least an hour, because her own tracks in the snow were half filled by drifting. He went out and crouched beside her on the other side of the heifer. They worked without words, as was their habit, warming the animal and getting it to its feet and walking it slowly to the barn, and it took 2 of them to do it, one on each side of the trembling animal, and their arms were touching through the whole of the slow walk to the barn, shoulder to shoulder and side by side, and neither of them acknowledged it, but neither of them moved away. They got the heifer into the barn and into the warmest stall, packed with extra hay, and Thomas checked her legs and found no real damage, just cold stress, and said so, and Mamie nodded and pressed her forehead briefly against the side of the heifer's neck, a gesture that was entirely private and entirely unconscious, and Thomas looked away to give her that moment. They stayed in the barn for a while after, because the barn was warmer than outside and the heifer needed watching. Mamie sat on a hay bale and Thomas sat on a barrel lid, and the milk cow Ruth moved around in her stall with a domestic unhurriedness that was deeply ordinary and therefore soothing. "I wanted to sell the cattle," Mamie said. She was looking at the heifer who was beginning to stop shivering. "After James, I thought about selling the whole place and going back to Ohio, though there is nothing for me there anymore, or going to California maybe. My brother was the one who knew cattle." Thomas looked at her. He said, "But you stayed." "I stayed." She was quiet for a moment. "James built this place." "Both of us did, but he drove the first post and he dug the first row in the garden, and he said this was where we were going to be. It felt like leaving him here if I left." Thomas thought about that and said nothing, because it did not require a response, only hearing. "Besides," she said, with something that was almost the ghost of a dry tone underneath it. "I cannot figure out how to get a 100-pound sack of grain onto a wagon by myself, and apparently I need a man to come out and point that out every week." It was the first thing she had said that even bordered on humor, and Thomas looked at her, and the surprise of it was on his face before he could arrange his expression, and she caught it, and something moved in her eyes, something quick and almost startled, like a bird flushing out of tall grass. "That is not why I come," he said. "I know," she said. And she looked at the heifer again, but her chin was lifted a little higher than before. February arrived and the hardest part of the winter passed, the way it always does, not dramatically but through slow accretion, one slightly less brutal day following another until you look up one morning and realize that the cold has begun its retreat. Thomas continued his Wednesdays and Saturdays. He had begun, without discussing it with Mamie or with himself, to think of the Atwood place as somewhere he belonged in a way that Caldwell itself did not quite provide. The boarding house was comfortable. Pete Harmon was a fair employer. But the 40 acres south of Bluebell Creek had a quality that he was only beginning to allow himself to recognize, and it was not separate from the woman who lived there. They talked more now. Not extensively. They were both people who had learned to value economy of speech. But there were conversations over the noon meal, which had become a regular thing, and conversations while they worked side by side on the fence line or in the barn, or in the kitchen garden where Mamie was beginning to plan her spring planting. He learned that she had read every book on that shelf above the fireplace at least twice, and that she had wanted to be a schoolteacher when she was young, but the circumstances of the move west had changed those plans, and that she could do mathematics in her head faster than most people could do them on paper. He told her about Texas, about the long flat country and the heat, and the way the stars looked out there on a clear night, like someone had flung a whole handful of salt across a black cloth. He told her about his father, who had been a man of few words and great patience, and about learning to read the land, the grass and the water and the behavior of animals, so that you never had to be surprised by what was coming. She listened the way she did everything completely, without looking away, and when she responded it was always to the actual thing he had said, not to a version of it that served some other conversational purpose. He found this deeply, inexplicably restful. On an afternoon in late February, they were working in the barn together, Mamie cleaning out the stalls and Thomas repairing a section of the loft floor where the boards had grown soft, and she stopped working and looked up at the loft where he was hammering. "Thomas," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He stopped hammering and looked down at her. She was looking up at him with that direct, careful look, and she said, "Why do you keep coming here?" He put the hammer down on the loft boards and sat back on his heels and looked at her. He took his time with the answer because the question deserved a real one. "Because you need things done," he said, "and I can do them. That is part of it." He paused. "And because I like being here." She held his gaze for a moment. "You like being here," she repeated, not skeptically but as if she were turning the words over to see what they were made of. "Yes," he said. She went back to raking the stall, but she was not quite the same afterward, and neither was he. March brought the thaw and the mud and the extraordinary smell of prairie coming back to life, that green and loamy smell that is one of the finest smells in the world, and that you can only truly appreciate after you have survived a Kansas winter. Mamie started her kitchen garden earlier than anyone thought was wise, and was right about the timing, because the ground warmed sooner than expected, and she had seedlings up by mid-March. She moved through the days with more energy than she had had since James died, not the energy of someone who had recovered exactly, but the energy of someone who had learned to carry the weight differently, balanced across the whole of herself rather than concentrated in one place. Thomas had begun to understand, sometime in the middle of February, that what he felt for Mamie Atwood had moved beyond the ordinary human instinct to help someone in difficulty. He was not a man who frightened easily, not at rattlesnakes or cattle thieves or hard winters or the long, uncertain miles of open country. But this thing frightened him a little, because it was large and quiet, and had taken root in him so gradually that he had not noticed its depth until he tried to imagine leaving Caldwell, and found the thought as uncomfortable as trying to imagine being without his right hand. He did not say anything about it. He continued to come on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and the time he spent there stretched naturally at both ends, arriving a little earlier, leaving a little later, until there were evenings where the two of them sat on the porch in the cold March twilight drinking coffee, the old dog Pepper between them, and talked about nothing and everything in the gentle way of people who have grown fully comfortable together. It was on one of those March evenings that she asked him, with a casualness that he recognized as deliberate, whether he planned to stay in Caldwell. "I have been thinking about that," he said, and looked at the sky where the first stars were appearing above the rim of the world. He said, "I would like to if there were reason to." A pause. He heard her breathing slow and then steady. "What kind of reason?" she said. He looked at her then directly the way he always looked at her. "Mamie," he said. It was only the second or third time he had used her name. It felt like stepping out onto ice, the deliberate kind of step where you feel for the solidity before you put your weight down. "Yes," she said. "I am not a man who is good at flowery speeches," he said. "I can work most kinds of land, I can handle cattle and horses. I know how to fix what breaks and build what is needed, and I would like to do that here, for this place." He paused. "For you, if you would have that." The silence that followed was one of the longer silences he had sat through with her, and he had sat through many. Pepper sighed from between their chairs. The night was very still and very cold, and the stars were coming out one by one in the darkening sky. "I am not the same as I was," she said at last. "Before, I do not know if I will be again." "I know you now," he said simply. "That is the person I am speaking to." She looked at him for a long moment. The porch light caught the edge of her cheekbone and the dark of her eyes, and he thought she had never looked so much herself as she did in that moment, unguarded and uncertain and present. "I think," she said slowly, "that I have been glad of you, more than I have known how to say." "That is enough," he said. "For now, that is enough." She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of his chair, and it was a light touch, barely more than the pressure of winter gloves against wood, but it was intentional and deliberate, and it meant everything. And he turned his hand over so that his palm was up and her hand was held in his, and they sat like that in the cold and the dark and the starlight for a very long time. Spring in Caldwell was a gradual and generous thing, the kind of spring that makes you feel the world is making a specific promise it intends to keep. The creek ran full and cold and clear. The cottonwoods came out in pale yellow-green along the bank. The meadowlarks returned and filled the mornings with sound. And on the Atwood place the garden was coming up in orderly rows. The cattle were moved to the south pasture, where the new grass was coming in thick. And there was a change in the quality of the light that settled over everything. Thomas came every day now. It had happened so naturally that neither of them had made a decision about it, the way the best arrangements often happen. He would ride out in the mornings and they would plan the day's work over coffee at the kitchen table, and he would stay until the work was done or until the evening made it sensible to stop. And sometimes, as the spring deepened, he stayed for supper and helped with the washing up and sat on the porch with her afterward until the dark was full and the coyotes had started their distant singing. There were people in town who noticed this and who talked about it, because a small town in 1879 was an observant and opinionated community, and a woman receiving daily visits from a man she was not married to was a thing that generated commentary. Mrs. Hennessy at the dry goods store told Mrs. Parrish that she hoped Mamie Atwood was being careful, that a man who came around without a formal proposal was a man with an informal intention, which was the polite way of saying she suspected the worst. Reverend Cole spoke to Thomas privately, with pastoral diplomacy, asking what his intentions were toward Miss Atwood, and Thomas said his intentions were entirely honorable, which was true, and that he would be addressing the matter formally very soon, which was also true, though he had not yet worked out exactly how. He worked it out on a morning in April, standing in the garden with Mamie while she staked up the bean plants, and he was supposed to be reinforcing the garden fence against rabbits. He had the post and the wire in his hands, and he was looking at her bent over the bean plants with her hair coming loose from its pins and a smear of garden soil on her forearm. And she was saying something about needing to plant squash on the south end because squash liked more heat. And he said, "Mamie, will you marry me?" She straightened up and looked at him. He was still holding the fence post. The garden was very quiet except for the meadowlarks. "You did not finish the fence," she said. "No," he agreed. She looked at him for a long moment, and he watched the expression move through her face, the way light moves across open ground, and then she said, "I have been waiting for you to ask that since January." "January," he said, somewhat startled. "When you held my hand on the porch," she said. "I knew then. I just needed to know you knew." He set the fence post down in the dirt and crossed the garden in 3 strides, and she met him in the middle. And he put his arms around her, and she put her face against his chest, and they stood in the April garden with the bean plants and the meadowlarks and the wide Kansas sky above them. He held her the way he did everything, steadily and without excess, but she could feel the realness of it in every point of contact, his hands on her back, the solid warmth of him, the slow breath. "Yes," she said into his chest. "Yes, I will marry you, Thomas Bailey." He pressed his chin to the top of her head. Outside the garden fence, Pepper barked once at something in the pasture and then fell quiet. They were married in May, on a Saturday afternoon at Reverend Cole's church in Caldwell, with about 40 people in attendance, which was most of the people Mamie knew and most of the people Thomas had come to know in his 8 months in town. Mrs. Parrish cried, which nobody was surprised by. Pete Harmon gave a toast at the reception in the churchyard that was brief and good-natured, and ended with him saying that Thomas was the best worker he'd ever had, and he was sorry to lose him, though he supposed the man had found better employment, which got a laugh. The widow Carson came and brought an apple pie and told Mamie that Thomas had fixed her barn roof so well that not a drop of rain had gotten in all winter, which she seemed to consider a high form of recommendation. Mamie wore a dress that Mrs. Hennessy had helped her make, a blue wool dress with white trim at the collar and cuffs, because she did not believe in being married in black, not today. She had her hair pinned up with 2 small pearl pins that had been her mother's, brought all the way from Ohio in a tin box wrapped in a handkerchief. And when she walked down the aisle of the church toward Thomas, she was looking at him very directly, the way she always looked at him, and he was looking back at her with an expression that was not complicated or performed but very simply true. The vows were the traditional ones, and Mamie said them in a clear voice that did not waver, and Thomas said them in the low, level voice that was his natural register. And when Reverend Cole said Thomas could kiss his bride, Thomas put one hand along the side of her face very gently and kissed her, and it was a real kiss, warm and unhurried, and someone in the pews said about time, in a whisper loud enough to be heard by most of the room. They drove back to the Atwood place, which was also the Bailey place now in the late afternoon, with the wagon loaded with gifts from the townspeople, jars of preserves and bolts of cloth, and a cast iron skillet from Pete Harmon that was clearly meant to be practical. Thomas drove and Mamie sat beside him on the wagon seat, close against his side, and he had his arm around her shoulders. The prairie was in full spring dress, the grass a deep and brilliant green, the creek running silver through the cottonwoods, the air smelling of wild roses from the thicket along the fence line. She said, "I want to build that bench, under the elm tree." He looked at her. He remembered what she had said in November about James and the bench and the shade tree. "We will build it," he said. "He would have liked you," she said. She said it simply, without the weight of earlier months, and he understood that it was offered as a gift rather than a burden. "I hope so," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and he held the reins in one hand and kept his other arm around her, and they rode home in the golden afternoon light. That summer was the kind of summer that a person carries for the rest of their life, not because anything extraordinary happened, but because everything ordinary felt extraordinary in the way of two people who have found each other, and are newly and constantly surprised by the goodness of it. Thomas moved his few possessions from Mrs. Parrish's boarding house to the Atwood place, and they rearranged the house to make room for him, and this rearranging was its own kind of intimacy, the negotiation of two lives making space for each other, which shelf got which books, which side of the bed, how the morning started and how the evening ended. He built the bench under the elm tree. He did it on a Sunday in June, working alone while Mamie was inside making bread, cutting the legs from good oak and the seat from a plank of smooth pine, and he fitted it together with pegs and mortise joints because he liked the work that way, things held together by their own design rather than by nails alone. When he called her out to see it, she stood in front of it for a moment and then sat down on it and put her hands on the smooth pine seat and looked up at the elm tree, which was in its full summer green, enormous and generous with its shade. She sat there for a while just sitting. He stood nearby, giving her that space, the way he always had. After a while she said he would have sat here for hours. "Good," Thomas said. "Then it is the right bench." She looked up at him and reached out her hand, and he took it and sat down beside her, and they sat together under the elm in the June shade. By late summer, Mamie suspected she was pregnant, and by August she was certain of it. She told Thomas on an evening after supper, sitting on the porch the way they did most evenings now, and she said it directly because she was a direct woman, and also because she was nervous, and the nerves made her more direct rather than less. "I am going to have a baby," she said. "In the spring, I think." Thomas went very still in the way he went still sometimes, not with absence but with intensity, the way a man goes still when something of great importance is happening, and he does not want to disturb it. He looked at her. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. He reached over and took her hand in both of his, holding it carefully as if it were something valuable and also something already valuable to him, and this was a different kind of value added to the same beloved thing. "Good," he said. His voice was quiet and she could hear something underneath the quiet, something that was too large and warm for words, which was why he had not put it into words. "Thomas," she said. "Yes, say something." "I am the happiest man in Kansas," he said, and the simplicity of it was so complete and so clearly true that she laughed, which was a full and real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deep, and he laughed too, and they sat on the porch in the August evening with the crickets starting up in the grass, and the stars coming out above the elm tree. The autumn of 1879 was different from the autumn of 1878 in ways that Mamie could feel at a level below thought. The same air, the same turning grass, the same cold coming down from the north, but she moved through it differently, the weight on her redistributed, some of it still the weight of loss because grief does not end. It only changes shape, but now there was also the weight of the life growing in her and the weight of Thomas, which was not a burden at all but the good weight of something solid that you can lean against. She thought about James often. She thought about him in the garden, where she was putting the beds to rest for winter, covering them with straw the way he had taught her, and she thought about him when she looked at the bench under the elm tree, which was now one of her favorite places to be. She thought about him without the terrible ringing hollow feeling that had characterized the first months, and she understood that this was not forgetting but integrating. The way a healed bone is different from an unbroken bone, but still does everything a bone is supposed to do. In October, a full year after James died, Mamie went out to the churchyard in the late afternoon with a small bunch of prairie asters she had cut from the last flowers at the edge of the property, and she laid them on his grave and stood there for a while. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Everything she felt was in the standing, the being present at the place where he was, and the quiet was the same kind of quiet as always, vast and real and not uncomfortable, just honest. Thomas had driven her to the churchyard, and he waited with the wagon at the gate, at the kind of distance that said, "I am here, but this is yours." When she came back to the wagon, her eyes were wet, but her face was steady, and he helped her up onto the seat and put the reins in her hands for a moment, because he knew she liked to drive when she needed to feel herself in command of the direction. And she drove home on the creek road in the October evening, and he sat beside her and did not say anything except once, when she turned at the cottonwood bend, left of the rut. She steered left. And then she smiled, just a small movement at the corner of her mouth, but real. The baby came in March of 1880, which was 2 years after James Atwood had been buried, and 6 months before anyone in the territory could have predicted that Caldwell would become one of the main cattle shipping points on the Kisham Trail, which it did, booming and straining, and filling up with cowboys and cattle and commerce, and the general noise of a frontier town becoming something larger and less quiet than it had been. But in March of 1880 none of that had quite arrived yet, and the town was still the town Mamie had known, and the Atwood Bailey place was still its 40 acres of hard-won ground with the garden and the cattle and the elm tree. The labor was long and difficult, as first labors often were, and Thomas spent most of it in the kitchen, being firmly excluded from the bedroom where the doctor's wife, who served as midwife in the absence of any other option, directed operations with a brisk authority. He sat at the kitchen table and did not pace, because pacing served nothing, but he got up twice and stood at the window and looked out at the March dawn with his hands flat on the windowsill, and each time a sound came from the bedroom he went very still and listened. When the baby cried for the first time, it was a sound that went through Thomas Bailey like a plucked string, resonating in chambers he had not known existed. He stood at the window for another full minute before the midwife opened the door and told him he could come in. Mamie was exhausted in a way that went all the way down, pale and damp, and with her hair pulled apart and that particular look of women who have done something immense and survive it and know it. She was holding the baby, a small, red-faced, very emphatic baby, and she looked up at Thomas when he came through the door, and her face did something complicated and beautiful. "It is a boy," she said. Thomas crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, and then at Mamie, and then at the baby again. He put one finger out very carefully, and the baby's hand closed around it with an authority that startled him. "Hello," he said to the baby. The baby considered him with the unfocused but somehow intense gaze of the newly born. "James," Mamie said quietly. "I would like to call him James. James Thomas Bailey, if that is all right." Thomas looked at her. There was a full and aching moment in which the name of the lost man and the names of the living ones were all in the same breath, and it was not painful exactly. It was something more like completeness. The past and the present folded into each other the way morning and night share a sky at dawn. "James Thomas Bailey," he said. "That is a good name." She smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, that tired and complete and radiant smile, and he leaned in and pressed his mouth to her temple and stayed there for a moment. Outside, in the early March morning, the meadowlarks were beginning to return. James Thomas Bailey grew with the speed and conviction that healthy children have in the world, demanding and curious and loud, and the Bailey homestead grew with him. By the summer of 1880, with the cattle trade coming to Caldwell, Thomas saw that the 40 acres could be expanded, and he and Mamie discussed it at length over several evenings at the kitchen table with the ledger book open between them, doing the mathematics of what was possible and what was practical. Mamie's head for figures was, as Thomas had told Pete Harmon once with considerable pride, better than any bank man he had ever met. They bought another 30 acres from the family that was moving on, a young couple who had tried the prairie and found it not to their character, and Thomas put up new fencing and built a proper barn to replace the repaired original, and they increased the cattle herd to 20 head, which was a real operation now, a thing that required organization and care and two people working it together. Thomas also spent some time in those years navigating the cattle trade in Caldwell, which was a rougher world than the quiet homestead, a world of stockyards and drovers, and the particular moral ambiguities of a boom town. He saw enough to be grateful for what he had and to hold tight to it. He saw men who had nothing to come home to and men who had things to come home to but had forgotten why they mattered, and he was neither, and he knew he was neither, and he was grateful for that knowledge. The cattle drives that came through Caldwell in the early 1880s were enormous, 2,500, 3,000 head at a time, raising a cloud of dust that could be seen from 10 miles away, and a sound that Mamie described as what she imagined it would sound like if the ground itself changed its mind about being still. James Thomas, who was 3 and then 4 in those years, thought the cattle drives were the greatest thing in the world and had to be physically restrained from running out to watch them from the road, which he could not understand was dangerous, and which Thomas explained in increasingly creative ways. It was during this period that Thomas hired 2 ranch hands to help with the expanded operation, young men named Eli Dawson and Hector Ruiz, both of them in their mid-20s, both of them good workers who became part of the rhythm of the place, in the way that working people become part of a place when it treats them fairly. Thomas paid fair wages and made sure the men were properly housed and fed, because he had worked for men who did not, and he remembered what that felt like, and he was not going to be that kind of man with land. He was aware, as a man of his time, that the world he moved through was not fair in its application of opportunity. Hector Ruiz, who was of Mexican heritage and one of the most skilled horsemen Thomas had ever seen, was treated in town with a carelessness that Thomas found offensive, and said so when he witnessed it directly. It was not a popular position with some of the men in the saloon, and it cost him a certain kind of easy social standing, but he had never valued that kind of standing highly, and Mamie told him she was proud of him, which mattered considerably more. They were happy in those years in the way of people who have built something real together and know its value. There were difficult times, a hard winter in 1881 that killed 3 of their cattle, and required them to drain a significant portion of their savings to get through without going into debt, an illness that swept through the town in the summer of 1882 and took Pepper the dog, who was very old by then and whose loss was mourned by all 3 of them, and various smaller difficulties of the ordinary kind, the wagon wheel that broke at the worst moment, the section of roof that let the rain in. The argument about the best way to rotate the pasture that lasted 3 evenings and was never fully resolved because they were both right and also both slightly stubborn. But the difficult times did not define the years. The years were defined by other things, by the mornings at the kitchen table before the baby, and then the small boy, and then the growing child was up and awake and needing things, those first quiet minutes over coffee that they protected with a mutual and unspoken agreement. By the evenings on the porch under the elm tree, which was an even larger and more magnificent shade tree than it had been when James Atwood had admired it. By the bench under that tree, where Mamie sat sometimes in the afternoons to think, and where Thomas sometimes joined her and sometimes left her to her thinking, because he had always known the difference between the kind of alone she wanted company in and the kind she did not. In the spring of 1883, Mamie told him she was pregnant again. They were in the garden, which was where the first announcement had been made too, though this time she said it with considerably more ease, and he picked her up with both arms around her waist and spun her once, which made her laugh in that full and deep way she had that always got into the center of him and moved around pleasurably. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1883, with Mamie's dark eyes and Thomas's steadiness, a quality of calm attention that she had from the first days. They named her Clara Rose Bailey, and James Thomas, who was 3.5 by then and had strong opinions about most things, declared that he did not need a sister, a position he revised completely within about a week of her arrival, at which point he became fiercely protective of her and sat beside her cradle with the gravity of a small man who has decided something important is his responsibility. By 1885, Caldwell was at its boom peak, a town transformed by the cattle trade into something considerably louder and more complicated than the quiet place Thomas had ridden into in 1878. There were new buildings on the main street, new businesses, new people, and the noise and energy of a frontier town at full extension. Mamie went into town regularly for supplies and was known there with a warmth and respect that reflected both her own standing, built over years, and the quality of the Bailey operation, which had a reputation for fair dealing and good cattle. She was different from the woman of 1878 in the ways that living changes a person, and the same in all the ways that matter. She still looked at things directly. She still did mathematics in her head faster than anyone else in the room. She still brought coffee out to the barn and said little when nothing needed saying. She had learned to accept help, which is a thing that takes some people a lifetime and others never manage at all. And she had learned that asking for help was not the same as being unable. It was simply knowing what you needed and being honest about it. She still sat on the bench under the elm tree sometimes and thought about James, her brother, who had been 26 years old and had never gotten to sit on that bench, and who would have liked Thomas enormously. She was more certain of that every year. The grief was not gone. It was not supposed to be gone. It lived in her the way the shape of a tree lives in a field even after the tree is cut, in the grass that grew differently there, in the hole of sky where the branches had been. It was part of her, and she had learned not to fight that. Thomas had watched her come through the grief and out the other side, and he understood that he had not brought her through it. He had not fixed it. You could not fix a thing like that. He had only been close and stayed close, and kept his hands busy and his presence steady, and his mouth mostly shut on the things that needed no words. He had understood from some instinct or some experience or some combination of the two that grief needed a witness more than a solution, and he had been that witness, and she had come through in her own time and by her own strength, and now she was here, and here was a very good place. On a September evening in 1885, the two of them were sitting on the bench under the elm tree after supper. James Thomas, who was 5 now and had his father's capability and his mother's quick mind, was somewhere at the edge of the yard chasing fireflies with a jar, and Clara Rose was asleep in the house with the windows open to the warm evening air, and the prairie was going gold in the last of the sunlight, and the cottonwoods down at the creek were turning the particular orange-yellow of early fall. Mamie was leaning against Thomas's shoulder, which was where she ended up most evenings on this bench, and he had his arm around her in the easy and permanent way of people who have been in the habit of each other for years. They were not talking about anything in particular, in the way of people who have a great deal to say and do not need to say any of it at this particular moment. James Thomas came running back across the yard with his jar and held it up, and it had 2 fireflies in it, small and intermittent, lighting up in the glass. "I got 2, he announced. "I see that," Thomas said. "Let them go before bed," Mamie said. "They belong outside." James Thomas considered this with the gravity of a 5-year-old, and then held the jar up and turned off the lid, and the 2 fireflies drifted upward into the evening and vanished into the darkening air, and he watched them go without apparent regret, which told you something about his character. "More tomorrow," he told them, and ran back out. Mamie watched her son, and Thomas watched the horizon, and the evening settled around the bench under the elm tree like water finding its level. She said, 7 years. He said, "What?" "Since you came to Caldwell," she said. 7 years in October. He thought about that. 7 years. "I was thinking about that day you came with the grain delivery," she said, "and you fixed the fence without being asked." "The fence needed fixing," he said. "Everything needs fixing," she said. "You chose that fence." He looked down at the top of her head, the dark hair that had some threads of silver in it now at the temples, and he thought about that first morning, the grain wagon, the thin November light, the woman who stood in the barn and pointed where to put the sacks and did not say a word. He thought about the 40 acres then, and the 70 acres now, and the 2 children, and the elm tree, and the bench, and the 7 years of mornings at the kitchen table. "I am glad I chose that fence," he said. She pressed closer against him, and he held her tighter, and James Thomas yelled something across the yard at a firefly, and Clara Rose made some small sound from inside the house that was not distress, just presence, the sound of a sleeping child turning, and the creek ran cold and clear in the cottonwoods, and the stars were beginning their business above the Kansas plain, and everything was, in the way that matters most, exactly right. In the years that followed, the Bailey place grew and settled into itself, the way good land does under consistent care, the way people do who have found what they are supposed to be doing, and who they are supposed to be doing it with. The cattle herd expanded and then reached a size that was sustainable, and they held it there, not grasping for more than the land could support. Eli Dawson stayed on and eventually brought a wife to Caldwell from back east, a lively woman named Frances who became one of Mamie's closest friends, and who came to dinner on Sunday evenings so regularly that it eventually stopped being an invitation and simply became the shape of Sundays. Hector Ruiz saved enough money over 4 years to put a small down payment on a piece of land north of town, and Thomas and Mamie both spoke well of him in every conversation where it was relevant, which helped him establish the credit at the land office that he otherwise might not have been given, because they knew what he was worth and they said so plainly. James Thomas Bailey grew into a boy who was as comfortable on a horse as most children were on their own 2 feet, who had his father's hands and his mother's eyes, and the double inheritance of steadiness and sharpness that was, people in town agreed, a formidable combination in a child, and would probably be a formidable combination in the man. Clara Rose grew into a girl of considerable quietness and considerable will, who loved the bench under the elm tree as much as her mother did, and who was, by the time she was 4, the most reliable person on the property for locating misplaced items because she watched everything with a meticulous attention. Mamie turned 30 in 1885, and Thomas turned 35, and they were in the fullness of things in a way that made the years of difficulty feel not erased but transfigured, the way winter is transfigured by spring, not removed from memory, but changed in its meaning now that the green has come. There came a morning in the spring of 1886 when Mamie was in the kitchen garden early, before Thomas was up, in the way she sometimes rose early to have the quiet before the house woke. She was kneeling between the rows of new beans, the same bean plants as every year, and the morning was one of those mornings that is so perfectly itself that it stops you, the light coming level and golden across the prairie, the air smelling of new growth and turned earth, the meadowlarks going absolutely wild in the pasture. She knelt there with her hands in the cool earth and felt completely present in the moment, the way she had not been able to feel for a long time after James died. Not absent of him, not unremembering him, but present in the life that had grown up around and after and through the grief, present in the garden that was also hers, and the house that was also hers, and the children sleeping inside, and the man she had married. She heard the screen door open and Thomas's boots on the back step, and she did not turn around. She just kept working, and she heard him walk across the yard, and then he crouched down beside her and picked up the other hand trowel and started working the row next to hers, which was what he did sometimes, came and worked alongside her in the morning quiet without announcement or ceremony. They worked like that for a while, in the silence that was their oldest and most fluent language, the language they had spoken before they spoke any other, and the morning light moved across the garden, and the meadowlark settled into a steadier note, and somewhere in the house, Clara Rose called for someone in that way of small children who wake up and immediately need to know that the world is still inhabited. Thomas stood and brushed the dirt from his knees and said, I will go." Mamie looked up at him in the morning light, her husband of 7 years, with the lines around his eyes that had deepened with weather and time and the gray that was appearing at his temples now, and she felt something so simple and so large simultaneously that for a moment it sat past the reach of words. Then she said, "Thomas." He paused. "I am glad you fixed that fence," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those gray-green eyes that she had come to know, like she knew the creek and the elm tree and the shape of the 40 acres in the first light, and he said, "So am I, Mamie." Clara Rose called again from the house, louder and with more authority. He turned and went inside, and Mamie turned back to her beans. And the morning went on in the way of mornings on a well-kept piece of land in the hands of people who love what they have built, and who they have built it with, which is to say the morning went on as if it intended to keep going for a very long time, which indeed it did. In 1887, they built a new bedroom onto the east side of the house for the children to share, with 2 windows and a proper pine floor that Thomas cut and laid himself. And the project took most of the late summer and early fall and occupied evenings for months, Mamie doing the finishing work on the walls, while Thomas framed out the windows. There was a satisfaction in the building of it that was different from the satisfaction of the work they did every day, because it was permanent in a different way, a room that would outlast them both, a room that James Thomas and Clara Rose would remember when they were old. The town of Caldwell continued its loud and complicated life around the edges of the Bailey place, and they participated in it as citizens, and as people who had a stake in the community, Mamie serving for 2 years on the committee that established the town's first proper school, and Thomas helping to organize the Cattlemen's Association that set standards for the herds coming through the territory. They were part of the place the way you are part of a place when you have been there long enough to have buried someone in its churchyard and raised children in its air. Thomas never forgot the first weeks, the grain delivery and the fence, and the woman who did not speak. He never forgot what it had felt like to sit on the back step of the house in the cold November afternoon and say nothing and have that be exactly right. He did not think of it often in a deliberate way, but it was there in him, the understanding that had come from that experience, the knowledge that presence does not require performance, that love in its earliest and truest form is sometimes just the willingness to be near without demand. He had carried that with him, and he would carry it all his life, not as a lesson or a lesson learned, but as a thing he knew the way he knew the prairie, the way he knew what weather was coming from the way the grass moved, and what kind of winter it would be from the thickness of the wool on the cattle in October. Mamie had carried her grief, and he had stayed near it without trying to move it, and it had moved on its own in its own time, and here they were on the other side of it together, which was where they were supposed to be. There was an evening in the fall of 1888, 10 years after James Atwood had been buried in the churchyard of Caldwell, when Mamie went out to the elm tree bench alone as the sun was going down. Thomas saw her go from the barn where he was finishing the evening chores, and he watched her walk across the yard and sit down on the bench that he had built in June of 1879, and which had weathered 9 years into a beautiful, solid, silver-gray piece of furniture that had shaped itself somewhat to the two of them from so much use. He finished the chores and washed up at the pump and went inside and put the children to bed. James Thomas, who was 8 and full of questions about everything, and Clara Rose, who was 4 and who wanted 3 stories before she would consent to sleep, and who got 2.5. He came back outside into the cool October evening and crossed the yard to the elm tree. Mamie was sitting on the bench with her hands in her lap, looking at the sky, which was doing something exceptional, a long band of orange and purple at the horizon, fading to deep blue above, the first stars very bright. He sat down beside her. He did not ask what she was thinking. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the silence that had been their first language and was still the truest one, the silence of 2 people who have been through something together and come through it, and are here now in the evening of a good life. And the stars continued their business above the Kansas plain, and the elm tree moved slightly in the wind, and the bench held them as it always had, steady and durable, and exactly what it was built to be. After a while Mamie said, "Do you think he would recognize us?" Thomas thought about James Atwood, 26 years old, thrown from a horse on a Tuesday in October of 1878, buried in the churchyard on the hill. "I think he would," he said. She nodded slowly, looking up at the stars. "I think so too," she said. And the evening held them, and the elm tree held its leaves for a little longer against the coming cold, and the bench under the tree held them both, and everything that had needed to be mended was mended, and everything that needed to grow had grown, and the grief that had opened a woman like a wound had healed the way wounds do when they are tended with patience and love, and the particular mercy of another person's steady presence. Not a presence that tried to make it better, but a presence that simply refused to leave. And so they stayed, Mamie and Thomas Bailey, on their 70 acres south of Bluebell Creek in Caldwell, Kansas, through the seasons and the years, through the hardships that come and the joys that come, through the children growing and the elm tree growing and the bench weathering to gray and the cattle herd steady at its sustainable number, through the boom of the cattle trade and the eventual quieting of it, through all of it together, which was the thing that mattered, which was the only thing that had ever mattered, and which was not an ending at all but the very shape of a life, full and complete and still ongoing in the best possible way.